Okay, so broadly speaking, continuing on from the previous section, um, I guess I should actually begin by outlining Foucault's ethical project and the reason why why I find it so uniquely productive and so uniquely important. Before I do, running the risk of again, turning this into a digression of a digression of a digression, by way of disclaimer, let me say the following: students sometimes ask me how do I deal with burnout, which is very much an occupational hazard within our profession of teachers of philosophy. And I sometimes answer, yeah, like in some sense, the answer is I don't. I lie on the floor, stare at the ceiling, and find myself completely unable to move and sort of an inch of my body, right? This is how I deal with burnout. Yeah, and I suppose that's a way of saying that I don't, right? But again, to try to bring this back to Foucault, this is how sort of again, like last year, second, third week of February is when my mind slowly begins to kick back in gear, and I begin looking myself in the mirror and asking myself like, what the hell am I doing with my life? And it's like being a professor is a wonderfully privileged job. I do have to, like, I feel compelled to say these words because many people are, I would imagine, are really struggling with life these days, and in general have struggled with life throughout history. And my biggest problem is sort of like, I wake up in the morning and I don't feel sort of as motivated as I used to, right? It's, you have to be in a very privileged position to have these sorts of problems. But at the same time, there's something wonderful to being, again, a professor, in the sense that you have this joy of new beginnings, right? Every semester a new class begins, often with different students, often with new students, and you have, a chance to go back a step and ask yourself, why do we do philosophy? What is philosophy? Why do we begin to philosophize, right? And over and over and over again, I find myself, again, this isn't just a job for me, right? I find myself driven to philosophy. Something, it's like Marx has this wonderful metaphor of how John Milton produces Paradise Lost the way that the silkworm produces silk out of internal necessity. And there's a certain kind of internal necessity that I feel as well, and it's kind of fun. Like it's almost already talking about Foucault's ethics, because of course it's not, philosophizing is not something I choose to do, and I kind of intimated in the previous segment that there's a certain deep antithesis in Foucault's philosophical project. Like Foucault's philosophy is antithetical to a certain kind of, Cartesian, Kantian philosophy, which imagines this free, what's the right phrase? Unchained subject, free-floating subject in the world of material objects, opposed to the world of material objects, opposed to the world of other people, right? And you ask all of these, deeply skeptical and relativistic questions like, what am I? What do I know for sure? What is my relationship to other people? Do other people even exist, right? And this seems to be the kind of the privileged starting point of modern philosophy with Descartes. And there was a period in my philosophical career when I thought that this was the privileged starting point, that this is where philosophy had to begin, right? And in an important sense, I don't think that anymore, right? And sort of what I'm talking about right now, this is my experience. This is my experience this semester, and I feel that this sort of description of, again, being driven to philosophy, again, in Heideggerian terms, we are thrown into this world. We find ourselves with certain beliefs, values, desires, and some of these, drives, fundamental drives, as Plato would say, I think the right way, or the best way to read Plato's dialogues is that human beings are beings of passion. We're driven by different passions, right? And you don't choose passion for philosophy. Notice this word, philosophia, love of wisdom, right? Love is a passion for knowledge, right? Thirst for knowledge. You don't choose this passion. You find yourself with this passion. It may be partly biological, partly, pre-programmed by our culture, or inculcated in us by our cultural milieu, but one way or another we don't choose it, and I don't choose it. And again, it's a very interesting experience I've had over the, so to speak, winter break, which wasn't much of a break for me. But when I try to watch movies or read literature, and none of this stuff really inspires me as much as philosophy does. I find myself driven back to philosophy. I've reread Kafka's Metamorphosis, and honestly, it's like, absolutely no offense to Kafka. Kafka is a brilliant writer, but it's like there's no comparison between, let's say, Kafka and Machiavelli for me. Like, the kind of enjoyment I get, the kind of kick I get out of reading, let's say, The Prince, is just incomparable to watching a movie or reading a book, even if it's a great book like Kafka's Metamorphosis. Right? And I don't choose that. I find myself with this kind of milieu. Now, of course, philosophers have this infuriating way of explaining their own enterprises, or philosophers, or at least some philosophers, that philosophy deals with the biggest, the most important questions ever, and so, claiming a certain kind of privilege to philosophy, and, I may be tempted to do something similar, right? Depending on the mood, very often I would start my classes by trying to defend and explain the philosophical enterprise, and to show the kind of the value and the relevance of philosophy, and in some sense, I guess I will do the same, at least to some extent, in today's talk, however you want to call that, when we get to Foucault. But sort of, let me again, continuing this this point, let me nevertheless try to get down to, so to speak, brass tacks, or however you want to call that, and let me say why I think Foucault is in opposition to this tradition, which goes from Descartes to Kant. I mean, Foucault, of course, very explicitly picks on Descartes in his hermeneutics of the subject. But again, this point that we have a certain kind of tradition that goes back to Socrates, and this notion of care of the self, taking care of oneself, right? So asking yourself, what is the right way to live, right? And this practice of care of the self as being the most important to human beings as human beings, so a defining feature of a thinking being, that we can think for ourselves and choose for ourselves. And also, very importantly, Foucault immediately contrasts this. He says that care of the self is not some kind of egoistic dandyism. So care of the self together with others. And he talks about how for the ancients, again, there's a certain notion in which you learn to govern yourself in order to be able to govern others. And especially sort of in the context of, let's say, democratic polis, such as Athens, taking turns, ruling and being ruled. So government of oneself and of others, right? And so, again, this idea that this is not egoistic dandyism, and also this is not some sort of apolitical, anti-political, alienated, like feeling of alienation from class, or from like some sort of lack of patriotism towards one's class or one's nation. So this is not how should I put this, like apolitical, alienated withdrawal from class or national allegiance. Which is to say that for the Athenians, again, Foucault begins with this dialogue, Alcibiades, and maybe we'll get to this at some stage and talk much more about what the dialogue is. I mean, I hope this is a first draft of a first lecture, and this is actually going to turn down the line at some point into a proper lecture series, and we could talk about what is the dialogue, what is the status of the dialogue, etc. But of course, so Alcibiades, an aspiring young Athenian, politician, again, the idea he and Socrates talks about, again, it's a beautiful dialogue in all sorts of ways, because, kind of the thrust of the dialogue, Socrates says to Alcibiades, he says, I know what you want, Alcibiades. You want to rule the world. And it's funny, it's kind of, I'm not sure what's the right word. Let's stick with the word funny for now. Kind of, there's a certain kind of an interesting analogy, because of course the kinds of students that I teach in the international relations program or in the economics program, many young students, this is what they aspire to. It is a bit of a joke. You want to be the king of the world. Well, nobody says king these days. You want to be a president of the world. You want to be the CEO of the world. You want to be a billionaire. You want to have the flashiest cars. The kind of the most honorary diplomas. You want to have the best spouse. Be members of the most powerful clans, right? But this is still very much. I mean, Plato talks to Alcibiades in the ancient Greek context, right? But this is so true today for so many students. This is the aspiration, or this is maybe the secret aspiration or the open aspiration. And of course, I mean, students are different, but after Freud, after Lacan, we have to recognize that human psyche is complicated. In this modular theory of the mind, it's not like you are one person who thinks one thing, right? So even the students who are inclined towards different ideals, aesthetic ideals, their aspiration is to become a writer or a painter, or their aspiration is, I don't know, to go join a Buddhist monastery or something like that. Still, a part of them, I would say, even though this is not a very well-defined phrase, this is not in any shape, matter, or form a very well-defined phrase, but still some module in their head, and this is what is not well defined. This talk of modules, right? This is a within evolutionary psychology. This is work in progress, and in fact, some students immediately would draw my attention, and actually some viewers on YouTube draw my attention to the fact that evolutionary psychology is controversial, and I agree with that completely. So take this phrase with a grain of salt, but still, sort of. After Freud and after Lacan, and in some sense this is already implicit in Plato, we have this understanding that within the human being there are different personalities that inhabit a singular individual, that we are actually not really singular individuals, right? But there are discourses, desires that inhabit our head to some extent, right? And so even among the students who may have other declared goals or other styles of life attached to themselves, countercultural or maybe ascetic, still, to some extent you have this aspiration. You want to become the ruler of the world, right? And so in a very straightforward sense, Alcibiades wouldn't say this out loud because it is outlandish and it's a bit shameful maybe, right? You're not supposed to say it out loud. Yeah, I want to become the king of the world. But Socrates catches young Alcibiades and he says, I know what you really want. This is what you want, fame and glory. And Socrates says this is the secret wish of your heart, and Alcibiades blushes, so to speak, because it's true. Socrates has put his finger on it, and so then there ensues a classical Socratic back and forth about what exactly would it mean to be the ruler of the world, and kind of the dialogue is long. I'm kind of jumping all over the place. Socrates reminds Alcibiades that Athens is not the center of the world. That even if you are a leading politician at Athens, there's Sparta, and Sparta in many ways is maybe more powerful, more glorious than Athens. Of course, at this stage in Athenian history, it's anybody's guess what's going to happen down the line, but we know, with the benefit of hindsight, that the Spartans actually win the Peloponnesian War, right? Another, maybe a much more obvious, not phenomenon, but obvious example that Socrates brings up is the Persia, right? The Persian Empire, which is clearly much more illustrious than either Athens or Sparta. And I feel that there's a certain kind of an interesting intimation, because that's kind of a bit of a quasi-Buddhist. I mean, I'm not saying that Socrates is Buddhist. I'm not saying that. But there is a certain kind of insight which I think resonates very well with the Buddhists, right? Because, right now, you, my dear listener, think to yourself, give me the name, 5 names of 5 different Egyptian pharaohs. Can you do that? And even if you can, do you know much about these names? Are you aware how many people around you know the names of the 5 Egyptian pharaohs? Of course, what I'm doing right now is that, like, at the time when those people were pharaohs of Egypt, they would think, they would imagine it's the most glorious, the most wonderful, the most desirable position to be in, right? And I could ask similar questions about, emperors of the Roman Empire, right? Very often, even my students in the international relations department, who are supposed to be knowledgeable in history, cannot give me 5 names of the Roman emperors. And even if they can, they don't know much about their lives. And it's, this funny question of who was the first emperor of the Roman Empire trips a lot of people up. Anyway, I'm sorry. I don't judge, okay? But it's like, the point is clear. The point is clear. The point is this wonderful Latin phrase, one of the Latin phrases that actually stuck with me ever since I was a child, and that I keep repeating to myself daily in various contexts. Sic transit gloria mundi. Sic transit gloria mundi. It is, in my head, a quasi-Buddhist phrase. Again, this idea that, this is how the glory of the world passes, right? That you can be the most powerful person around, but then you die and you get forgotten. And as Marcus Aurelius says, by the way, another book I'd love to do a seminar on, partly because I love it so much, partly because I disagree with half the things Marcus Aurelius says. But one very beautiful insight that he has, Marcus Aurelius says that you die, and there will be people, this significant proportion of people at your funeral are going to be happy that you are finally dead. And it doesn't really matter who you are. For most people, it's true. There's always somebody who is happy to see you die. And that's supposed to be a very sobering, a very sobering thought, right? And so then this dialogue between Alcibiades and Socrates gets into this issue of harmony, because, presumably if Alcibiades wants to be this glorious Athenian politician and lead Athens to glory, he needs, Alcibiades needs to secure strength, Athenian strength at home. And how do you do that, right? And the question of harmony comes in, right? This idea that kind of strong Athens is united Athens, strong Athens is harmonious Athens. And then they realize that, within the dialogue, that Alcibiades cannot really explain what this harmony means or how to achieve it, or even just what it means, right? And ultimately, of course, for Plato, well, I say of course, but with caveats and asterisks, in the kind of reception of Plato that we have today, whenever we talk about harmony in the polis, we have to always think about the harmony of the soul. And this is kind of where the dialogue leads, because Alcibiades, turns out, doesn't understand political harmony or justice in the polis. Likewise, he doesn't understand the psychic harmony or the justice in his own soul. So Alcibiades does not know how to govern others, and he does not know how to govern himself. And this is a very interesting way of phrasing the question. And of course, especially down the line, again, Foucault's exploration of the hermeneutics of the subject, again, of how these ancient practices of taking care of oneself. And again, it's like Foucault, this is, I'm trying to say everything at the same time, but of course, is Foucault giving prescriptions? And the answer is no, for 2 reasons. And this is kind of an interesting aspect of Foucault's enterprise. So Foucault's ethics, always with a question mark, because this is problematic. On the one hand, Foucault just does not believe in philosophers giving prescriptions. It is not the job of the philosophers to tell us how to live and what to think. So it is not up to philosophers to tell us how to live or what to think. And you can ask exactly why does Foucault say that, but, we'll leave it for another time. But, there's a certain kind of, preliminary skepticism or mistrust towards philosophy, kind of classical skeptical arguments. we should not necessarily trust. And again, it's like goes back to Socrates. Socrates would also say, again, this wonderful phrase associated with Jürgen Habermas, der Zwang losen Zwang des besseren Arguments. The only force that a free citizen recognizes is the peculiarly unforced force of the better argument, right? And Socrates, very famously identifying himself as a gadfly and a midwife in Plato's Apology, does not claim to be a teacher to whom you should just listen and just follow the advice, right? You are supposed to think for yourself. And this is what Socrates claims or tries to do vis-a-vis Alcibiades and vis-a-vis all his other interlocutors. In private dialogues, a dialogue between Socrates and Alcibiades is a private dialogue, one-on-one. Apology is a weird exception. Is one of the, one of the few places, maybe the only place, when Socrates actually addresses the Athenian demos at large, and not just an individual person. Not just individual person or a group of people in a private setting. Okay, so it's not up to philosophers to tell us how to live and what to think. Also, very importantly, Foucault is going to say that the task of philosophy in general is this experiment, this attempt to think otherwise. Establish, as he says, a new and strange relationship to oneself. Find kind of a different way of thinking and a different mode of living. So discover different ways of thinking, different modes of existence or of living, right? And to a large extent, I mean, this is very much against Kant, who was looking versus Kant's a priori, right? Right. So I cannot spell this time of day. Kind of Kant's idea that we are trying to find. Come on. Yes. We are trying to find. Some sort of universals, right, for Kant. Universals of thought, universals of morality, right? And Foucault wants to say, no, let's not look for universals. Let's find something that rules, let's find something that looks a priori, let's find something that looks universal, and let's deconstruct the universality and the, a prioricity, right? And find out that, in fact, it's not universal, it's not a priori, but there's a different mode, there's a different way to live, right? Behind all of this, right? So it's not up to philosophers, and so philosophy is this experiment, but also very importantly, again, and Foucault does want to say that ancient ethics. He talks about how it ends up with a profound error, in a profound error, or it's like a misunderstanding. So ancient ethics, let's say, runs into a dead end. His own phrase is, again, profound error, I think. And when he talks about this profound error, he talks about universality, and I feel like he talks about how the universality of ancient ethics ultimately leads to a certain kind of very oppressive, Stoic and Christian ideology. So universalization leads to oppressive, ideological, Stoic, later Stoic, and early Christian way of mode of subjectification. Christian mode of subjectification. Basically, we're talking about some docile bodies. If you want to really oversimplify, the idea is slaves obey your masters. Slaves obey your masters. And this is kind of, this is one of the reasons why I have this very interesting love-hate relationship with, let's say, Marcus Aurelius' Meditations, because on the one hand, it's a wonderful text. I think it's a very productive text. It talks about, how do we relate to ourselves? How do you construct oneself, a project of oneself? But on the other hand, it tends to be very socially conservative, I feel. And again, like Marcus Aurelius has a certain kind of way of looking at the world with Aurelius's relationship to the gods is a little bit on the agnostic side, but still I do feel that like at the end of the day, Aurelius believes in divine providence and in some form of theodicy, that this world is a product of the good gods, and you are born to station in life, and you are supposed to, do your job well, right? So this is, and I would say, I would characterize this as a repressive, oppressive, ideological mode of subjectification. Again, ultimately bottoming out in this notion of slaves having to obey their masters, right? So on the one hand, so it's like, sorry, what I'm driving at is again, Marcus Aurelius in the Meditations, at the same time offers good productive advice, but this good productive advice is intermixed with this ideological, to some extent theological, oppressive ideology of the Roman, Empire, Pax Romana, which bottoms out in, again, slaves obey your masters. Like, we are born to station in life, and it's our duty to obey. Like, kind of this value of unconditional obedience. I suppose so again. So we're talking about this stuff, but then so this is kind of in the negative, on the negative side. But then there's something on the positive side, and what we have on the positive side is this idea, again, and I really like to invoke Nietzsche, Freud, and Marx, and maybe Buddha as well. So, but on the positive side, there's this idea that you don't discover the truth of the subject. It's not like you dig deeper and somehow beneath the surface you find out what the individual really is, right? And this is, in some sense, this is why the course is called Hermeneutics of the subject, understanding, finding a secret, like the secret of what you are, right? So instead, we are talking about the project of construction. We are talking about the project of construction. So the self is not discovered, but constructed. Okay, and I broke my slide. Let me fix this. But constructed. So this is kind of, again, post-Freudian, and maybe do I want to call this quasi-Buddhist? I'm not sure. So compared to Freud or compared to Buddha, right? That basically, and I keep talking about this teleological versus mechanistic worldview. Mechanistic versus teleological. And kind of there's idea that there's no essential self. So no essential self in the sense that there's no soul. And there's no free will. And in an important respect, in this kind of ontological, metaphysical, post-Christian way, there's no moral responsibility. And there's no sin. So no moral responsibility and no sin. When I say no moral responsibility, I want to say kind of no metaphysical moral responsibility, because again, there's different ways of understanding these things, and the question of freedom. So no ontological free will, because there are different ways of understanding all of these words, and it's like I feel that there can be a certain kind of a meaning to the words freedom and responsibility, even within the mechanistic picture, but it has to be a different freedom. It has to be a different meaning, again, to these words, like freedom and responsibility. So, but very importantly, so it's a project of immanent ethics. So the self is not discovered but constructed, and the idea of the care of the self is how you, in some sense, construct yourself together with others. And this has to be immediately a problem, because if you construct yourself this needs to be explained, because what are you? What are you? So maybe writing this in brackets, let's say you construct yourself together with others, with the help of others, and this idea that there has to be like a school, a philosophical school, or maybe a mentor. And this is obviously a problematic, potentially power-laden relationship, right? This is not innocent, right? And it's not innocent, it's dangerous, because how do you know? How do you know whether the school or the mentor are actually helping you construct yourself, or are they indoctrinating you, right? And so here's the question, like, what is authenticity versus indoctrination? And so from the very beginning, you run into this interesting set of problems between, you kind of get stuck between relativism and absolutism. Let me maybe do it this way. Okay, so between relativism and absolutism, between skepticism and trust, right? If you want hermeneutics of suspicion and hermeneutics of trust. Between, you know, like in a very straightforward fashion, between conflict and consensus. Between conflict and consensus. Something that I talk about at great length in my Coursera course, starting with the ancient sophists, right? And between I don't know, individualism, you know, between individual and the collective. How you construct yourself, but only with the help of others, right? And so kind of Foucault's ethics is kind of in the middle of all of these, right? And of course, I mean, I have so many videos on my channel, and I talk about this at great length. In some sense, I do hope that anybody who's listening to this is at least aware of the Nietzschean project, or maybe heard my lecture on Nietzsche. But Nietzsche is a very important background for Foucault, but also for me in explaining Foucault. There are no capital V values. Capital V values are dead. Instead, we have these small v values. And the question, the small v values are necessarily man-made and contingent, right? And so, but the question is, how do we discover them? And so the idea is that, yes, they are contingent but not arbitrary. Values are contingent. They are, in fact, constructed, but not arbitrary. And I suppose, let me go a little bit on a tangent, and this is going to be a bit of a biographical tangent. This, to me, is the stake of trying to develop a course like this on Foucault, and to trying to teach a course like this on Foucault, right? And this, I'm not sure how coherently I'll be able to explain this, and this is a very big idea for me, and this is a big idea I'm circling around. So I'm not sure if I'll be able to explain this very clearly, but let me try, right? So at the running the risk of being of completely losing, getting off track. So let's write Foucault and the project of enlightenment and the enlightenment. So first of all, again, something I don't like talking about, but force myself to talk about this, is Russia in the 90s, right? Russia in the 90s. The person who was born and grew up in Russia in the 90s, again, I saw society collapsing around me, right? And so this question of values, and of asking what are the values of the value of values, how do you define the word good, right? The fact that you cannot just accept the definition of the word good. And I'm not sure, again, it's like, I don't want to, this is potentially a whole separate lecture, and I do talk about this extensively, I think, when I start my course on political philosophy with the sophists. Again, you, my dear listener, can probably find some sort of, historical examples which are uncontroversial to you. Think of some sort of horrible, abusive social arrangement, be it ancient slavery or medieval serfdom, where very clearly you would, or maybe like medieval witch hunts, where you, my dear listener, would agree and would say that this was an abusive arrangement. It was sustained for ideological reasons, and people maybe did not understand what they were doing, or they were indoctrinated on purpose, or maybe there was some kind of a structural dynamic. This is kind of an interesting meaning of the word ideology, when, yes, it's a lie and a misrepresentation, but it's not like it's mystification, conspiracy theory, like certain people are lying to other people. No, in some sense, you have this culture which misrepresents reality to the entire society. And so, like, at the end of the day, you could say, yes, maybe it's the lords who exploit the serfs, but in some deep sense, maybe the lords themselves don't even understand that they're exploiting the serfs. That's a possibility. That's a possibility of this kind of systematic, power-laden misrepresentation of reality, which again, I don't know, hacks the brains or indoctrinates everybody in society, including the intellectuals, or including those in power. Everybody is misled. This might not be, again, like a neutral or benign misrepresentation because it favors certain groups over others, but still, people are misled. People are misled. And so, this was a very important kind of privileged starting position for me, kind of this position of moral skepticism, some sort of moral skepticism. And the kind of the basic charge, the challenge of the sophists, sophistic challenge, is that the word good or justice doesn't mean anything. Good or justice is just the mask for the interest of the stronger, or is just the mask of somebody's interest, is just a mask for interest of a particular group, right? And broadly speaking, kind of the hope in the project of enlightenment, the Enlightenment project, is that we can get over this. We can get over this. And that society can become transparent to itself. And there's a certain kind of social contract element to this. Like even in Hegel or in Marx, who are strictly speaking critics of the social contract project, there's still a certain kind of, again, kind of social contract element that, again, the legitimacy of the government is derived from the consent of the governed. And that this consent is an informed consent. So you have this informed consent, and there's the consensus about true interests. Right, let's use the word true in quotes, right? And there's supposed to be some sort of a procedure of public deliberation, something that, for example, John Stuart Mill would call free and equal discussion. And there's some kind of transparency and accountability in the political system. Transparency and accountability. And of course, definitely there's a certain kind of strong assumption, strong, robust assumption about I could write quasi-Aristotelian assumption about the pro-social character of human nature. Come on. I like to spell it this way, I think. Of pro-social character of human nature. Yes. That we become properly human and properly happy only in well-ordered societies, right? And that kind of the flourishing of the human individual, the unchaining of the human creative potential, kind of, again, this free development of each as a condition for the free development of all. That human beings, again, become properly human, properly happy only as members of well-ordered societies, and that we become happy by doing something essentially pro-social. Free development of each, free development of all, right? And Foucault, of course, kind of looking back at this slide, between relativism and absolutism, between skepticism and trust, between individual and collective, I think that Foucault, broadly speaking, is on board with this project, which is a very tendentious thing to say, because Foucault is supposed to be a big critic of this project. Well, okay, so let me write it this way. So Foucault is both a critic and a proponent of this project, which is kind of between, Foucault between enlightenment and anti-enlightenment. I feel that Foucault affirms the ideal of this enlightenment, but he's very skeptical about whether this this promise of the enlightenment has already been delivered in our society today, right? And this is like a huge pet peeve of mine and a huge discussion. This is something that I sort of became very, very obvious to me once I have recorded my Coursera course, and when I came to classrooms, that we live in a society which is profoundly, intellectually, is at war with itself. We do not have a social consensus about what are values, yes? And I feel that kind of my hope is that we are stuck in a transition. This is my hope. And in some sense, again, for me, the hope or the promise of reading Foucault's hermeneutics of the subject is a way to approach this question, to tie this question down, sort of to explore the book, explore the course, and by way of exploring the course, explore this problem. And maybe again, like bring it to the forefront that we are stuck in a transition. So this is kind of this is my own take. Stuck in a transition. Transition, you know, I would say like in a Kuhnian fashion, Thomas Kuhn, Kuhnian paradigm shift. And the idea is that, you know, hopefully the project of enlightenment can be realized and we can have a consensus on values. And so I kind of want to signal a couple things. So first of all, I've always viewed analytic philosophy, you know, Anglo-American analytical philosophy with huge suspicion, analytic philosophy. And kind of, I'm going to talk about this in a second. But also, there's this problem of like popularization of science, or let's say science communication, or maybe social science communication, social science, or, you know, trying to communicate ideas from social science or from philosophy. And in kind of both of these cases, the idea is that kind of the reality is more complex, right? So let's start with Anglo-American analytic philosophy, right? The hope is that, Daniel Dennett puts this very, very nicely. He says, philosophers have this erotic dream that you make an argument, and your argument is so good that if somebody disagrees with you, their heads have to explode, right? This is kind of the hope and the dream of analytic philosophy. But we are talking about ethics. Think about your values. You know, many people hold certain kinds of values very strongly, right? Maybe people believe in human rights, or they believe in democracy, or they believe that slavery is wrong, or let's say gender oppression is wrong. And now go back in your mind 1,000 or maybe 2,000 years into the past and imagine presenting your best argument for gender equality to Aristotle, or presenting your best argument for against slavery to Aristotle, or to some sort of an ancient Aristotelian, right? You see where I'm getting at, right? Like if you've actually read philosophy, if you understand how this works, and this is why Thomas Kuhn is infinitely more important, I feel, for us than Karl Popper, because Popper, again, is under this very strange and actually wrong illusion. So that, you know, worldviews can be falsified. And the answer is no, because I don't think that there's any simple, straightforward way in which you can falsify, let's say, Aristotelian defense of slavery, right? So this is a certain kind of sociological transformation, sociological political transformation. Culture evolves. Different people have to be born with a different cultural code in their head. It's like, this is a very stupid example. I need to find a better example, but still, it's like, because I teach in the international relations department, I've been exposed recently to certain kind of debates around Brexit. Oh my God, this is Jupiter forbid. I don't want to touch this topic with a 10-foot pole, okay? And it's like, I'm enlightened enough to understand that I'm to such an extent not an expert on any of the on this topic that you should not listen to anything I say on Brexit. But let me just give you one sound bite, and the sound bite is the following. So Britain right now is in the process. Actually, I'm not even sure what is the stage of transition of Britain trying to leave the European Union, but it's some stage, whatever. But the point is, if you ask people who voted leave or voted remain, if you ask them how the economy is doing, not their projections into the future, but if you ask them how the economy is doing right now, depending on whether they voted leave or voted remain, they will have different appraisal of the facts. This is Kuhn. This is not Popper. This is Kuhn. Depending on your worldview, you count different things as facts. If you voted to leave the European Union, you are more likely to say that the economy is doing well. You're looking at different measures, different charts. You appraise the situation differently. If you voted remain, now that the Britain is in the process of leaving, you are more likely to say that the British economy is doing poorly, right? But it's like facts are relative to worldview. And you can imagine this like, Brexit is of course an explosive topic, whatever. Let me leave and forget I ever brought this up, but I hope the example is instructive. Like in a similar fashion, you can ask yourself, how do you feel right now? How do you feel right now? I could ask myself, how do I feel right now? And it's not a simple question. It's not a simple thing to answer, right? And to a very large extent, this is what Foucault wants to talk about in the hermeneutics of the subject. Again, all of this question about are you happy? What is happiness? The economy of desire. So let's say Foucault and this kind of microphysics of power, the politics of the everyday, politics of the everyday. So the question of how do you feel right now? Are you happy? Sort of like, what is your relationship to your desires? Like, are you in control of your desires, or are your desires in control of you? Right? And there's this very interesting, so just to pick one. So let's let's talk about sex. Let's talk about wealth. Let's talk about maybe asceticism. I'm obviously not going to talk about this at great length. Again, this is the point of me wanting to do a lecture course on this, because I feel that each of these topics deserves attention at great length. So sex, wealth, asceticism, desire for honor or glory, recognition, honor, glory, recognition. What do you think is the kind of the meaning of life? Family, salvation, right? Salvation of your soul, or what have you, right? And so, and the two examples I had in mind, one example was the example of Sophocles. This is probably not Sophocles himself speaking. It's a very famous quote about how maybe a character, probably, was it Sophocles himself? Okay, let's just roll with it. I think Sophocles himself says that, how is old age? This is, among other places, this is quoted in Plato's Republic. So Cephalus quotes Sophocles in Plato's Republic. And the idea is that Sophocles is very happy that as he has gotten old, he has become sexually impotent and now he thinks that sort of sexual impotence is actually a great boon. It's a wonderful thing that has happened to him. He says he has escaped from sexual desire the way that one escapes from like a rabid and cruel master. You have escaped from a mad master, a mad tyrant. So freedom from sexual passion. So actually, sexual impotence as a boon. Freedom from sexual passion, as if freedom from a mad tyrant. This is a very interesting example, I feel. What do we say about this, right? And so it's like I'm reminded of Marcuse's wonderful phrase, repressive desublimation. That the fact that you allow people to gratify their desires does not mean that your society has become freer. No, maybe it's like the use of pleasures, right? The kind of the pleasures used against you to control you. And another example, so this is an ancient example. The modern example I want to give is like, who decides what you think about? Who decides what's on your mind? And so, especially today, again, in terms of the microphysics of power and politics of the everyday, the question is it you or is it the, let's say, YouTube, Facebook, or I don't know, Instagram, TikTok, whatever, algorithm? Right? That's the dangerous and problematic question to ask, right? So again, microphysics of power, politics of the everyday. Do you decide, or is it the algorithm, right? And so there is no simple alternative, but of course, again, like Foucault's ethics in this kind of positive fashion, again, this idea that the self is not discovered but constructed, that you construct yourself with the help of others, a school or a mentor, right? This idea that carefully, against the external world, and again, Socrates says in Alcibiades, this is a very clear line of reasoning, which I am very fond of, and I am very receptive to. Something I like to talk about at the beginning of philosophy courses. That Socrates says in Alcibiades that the first task of philosophy is to unlearn all of the deleterious effects of society, to become free from the deleterious effects of society on you. That our society is bad, our education is bad. That again, Alcibiades, born an aristocrat into an aristocratic family, but his education is horrible. And the values that the multitude holds are bad. The values are bad, and the education is bad. And again, he talks about how the many in the street, the hoi polloi, they have no idea what's good for you in life. Again, this phrase by reminded of this phrase by George Carlin, wonderful American philosopher, comedian, stand-up comedian. So it's bad for you. It's what the random person thinks in the street. These thoughts are bad for you, actively bad for you. They make your life bad, right? So the many are wrong, and also he talks about the teachers, and he says, Socrates asks Alcibiades, "Who was your teacher?" Turns out it was some slave. And ask yourself this question again. It's like I teach students in a prestigious university, prestigious diploma, also incidentally costs a lot of money. And ask yourself, who are the teachers of these wonderful students that I have in front of me? What kind of school did they go to? And who were their teachers in school? I mean, is this, being a teacher at school, is that a valued profession? Socrates talks about how Alcibiades was brought up by a family slave. He says, you, my dear Alcibiades, the future leader of Athenian democracy, you were educated by a slave. And look at schools today and ask yourself, who were your teachers? I mean, obviously not slaves in a strict fashion, but again, like very often, even in highly prestigious schools that people go to, it's like again like a job of a school teacher is not a very prestigious job, and not necessarily a very well-paid job, right? So very often, people who are have great aspirations in our society receive less than ideal education. Right? there's more to be said about this, but like in general, like in terms of values, in terms of social esteem and monetary compensation, and here, of course, my Marxist credentials rear their head. So the consideration of money is complicated, but it has to be there. But in terms of social esteem and in terms of monetary reward, it's very clear that it's like, it's not the Nobel Prize winners. And it's, even think of Foucault, right? Chair of his own, I'm not sure the word department is the right word, but like a person who has his own chair at the Collège de France, at the same time, clearly not necessarily a very influential person. Yes, widely cited, but is Foucault very influential? Like I'm telling you, I'm trying to share some thoughts which are, I'm not exactly retelling Foucault's philosophy, but to some extent, I'm trying to share some thoughts. Many of you, my dear listeners, have an interest in Foucault. Have you had any of these? Have you heard any of these thoughts before? Do you know that Foucault had this keen interest in ancient ethics and opposed ancient ethics to, let's say, Christian ethics, and saw in the ancient ethics not necessarily an answer to the problems of today, but saw a very fruitful paradigm, a very fruitful lens about which to, through which to think about the kinds of lives that we live, right? Most of you probably have not heard this, right? And this has to, it's like this shows the problem with relating the project of enlightenment to the kind of society that we live in. Yeah, like nominally, we pay lip service to the project of enlightenment, but as a matter of fact, and this is kind of what I was trying to talk about, this kind of stuck in a transition. Again, there's this optimism, this optimistic view that we are stuck in a transition. That versus analytical philosophy, it's never about a single, like logical argument. It's not like Foucault deals in these simple thought experiments, like geometrical constructions, or maybe like Baconian crucial experiments. So geometric constructions or Baconian crucial experiments. This is not how you get converted into Foucault's philosophy. It's more like, it's more like learning a different language, right? And you do it step by step, and you become better at it progressively. It's like you are learning in Wittgensteinian terms, like a new mode of life, a different way of looking at things. This, Wittgensteinian duck rabbit. This is what we're talking about. Kuhnian paradigm shift. Okay, let's maybe add this. Wittgenstein's duck rabbit. I hope that these ideas are familiar to you people. If not, maybe we can talk about them some other time, right? But not Popperian simple crucial experiments, right? And so what I've been talking about, the kind of social science, philosophy, communication, is this idea that we do a very bad job of communicating social science or philosophy, because it's like, I want to finish. I want to write something on the slide. Foucault is popular, yes, but we don't know Foucault. Foucault is popular, but we very clearly don't know Foucault. We don't know and we don't understand Foucault, even though he's so popular. And this, to me, is a profound problem. Again, the hope is that we are just simply in a transition. And Galileo had a hard time communicating his heliocentric worldview to the general public. But just give it time, and we'll get over this transition, and we'll find a way to explain to people kind of the project of enlightenment and some sort of, again, like I feel the need to add this somewhere, kind of in my own head. You have this. I said in September, I think, that the three most important philosophers for me this year would be Buddha, Marx, and Foucault. and kind of Nietzsche was there. Maybe I was kind of thinking, should I add Nietzsche? Should I not add Nietzsche? But let's roll with Buddha, Marx, and Foucault, because all three I feel have this important reformist like are in a similar reformist business, and all three are critics of society, and all three have a certain kind of positive pro-social ethic, because this isn't just criticism for the sake of criticism. Again, between relativism and absolutism, between skepticism and trust, between individual and the collective, all three, Buddha and Marx and Foucault, have a certain kind of positive ethical project, right? But I'm trying to to end my discussion here, not discussion but explanation, right? So Foucault is popular, but we don't know Foucault, in the sense that science communication is hard, right? And these ideas that these philosophers are talking about are genuinely hard. They are hard to understand. They are hard to communicate. The optimistic hope is that it's just a matter of time. It's just a matter of technique. And we'll be able to get over this. And that everybody will be able to understand Foucault. The same way how, children at school can right now understand Galileo's arguments, at least in basic terms, right? I mean, technically speaking, of course, Galileo was wrong. And, the sun is not the center of the solar system, but, there's a center of mass of the solar system, right? Which is given to us by Newton's equations of motion. I don't know, colleagues, ask yourself this. Do you understand this? Is this the first time you've heard this, right? And if you do not understand this, if this is the first time you've heard this, then maybe, my optimistic hope is a little bit too optimistic, because like even with respect to Galileo, several centuries later, we still maybe don't understand necessarily the terms of the debate, right? But at least the hope is it's just a matter of time. It's just a matter of time. But, and this is kind of sort of, I'm not sure if it's going to be clear. Well, I hope that this will clarify some things, right? So when I was an undergraduate, again, to some extent, I thought that this was just growing pains for me, growing pains for me personally, and for the society in transition, Russian society of the 90s, in which I found myself. And I was hoping that this will just go away. That I need to do philosophy for a certain number of years, and I will understand what to do with myself and what society needs to do with itself, right? So this was the hope. This was the hope of me, a young person, right? And had this, and it's interesting because I started by reading Foucault, and I've had certain insights. And Foucault is a very, is a very popular philosopher, but also a very controversial philosopher. And I found problems talking about Foucault and trying to communicate Foucault. And one idea I've had is that I should just stick with Foucault, stick with post-structurist and specialize on this. But I found it increasingly difficult to communicate Foucault to other people in terms of Foucault. So naturally, what I thought I'd do, and I'm very happy I did that. In fact, I think it was the right way to do this, right? I branched out. And I started doing all sorts of philosophy. Philosophy outside the West, ancient India, ancient China, ancient Greek philosophy, classical European philosophy. And gradually over time, and then very happily, about 5 or 6 years ago, I got my first lecturing position. And as a lecturer, teaching my own course, first in philosophy of science and then in political philosophy, I found a certain way of communicating my insights to the students. And starting with more or less uncontroversial, more or less basic premises, and kind of get to the Foucauldian conclusions, starting with the ancient Greeks. So go from ancient Greeks to Foucault, or go from the Rig Veda to Foucault, or go from classical modern European philosophy, from Descartes to Foucault, or go from, let's say, Hobbes to Foucault. And I saw certain, limited success in my enterprise. Certainly, I was not able to reach all the students, but, this was an emotional roller coaster, and I developed deeply personal relationships with many different texts, like Hobbes' Leviathan, and with many different students. And it was an amazing, it's like 10 or 11 years of teaching now. But at the same time, so the high watermark for me was preparing and recording the Coursera course this August, right? And I thought that kind of after 10 years of teaching, finally I was able Obviously, the Coursera course is imperfect and it could be improved, but it was a very important watershed moment for me. Finally, I was able to express my ideas. I feel like well enough, not necessarily perfectly, and obviously I did not expect to convince everybody. But at last, I was able to get together a certain kind of concise and coherent argument. And as soon as I finished the recording the Coursera course, I thought, well, finally now sort of we can start with common positions, and I'll be able to to talk to people, to communicate again a certain kind of vision to people. And what I realized since the start of the year is that to a very large extent, my Coursera course, in my own experience, was a complete failure because for the vast majority of students, like it's completely incomprehensible and incomprehensible and unconvincing. Incomprehensible and unconvincing, right? And it's like, again, I don't want to necessarily make big claims for myself. I'm a young professor, and like in general, I don't think necessarily very highly of my course. It could be improved, but you see, the point of the project of the Enlightenment is that the deep philosophical truths should be communicable, right? Like, if we're trying to explain basic physics, again, like go back to Galileo, geocentric versus heliocentric model, it should be a doable enterprise. A random teacher, like an average teacher, an average school teacher of physics should be able, using simple arguments, der zwanglosen Zwang des besseren Arguments, using simple arguments, peculiarly unforced force of the better argument, should be able to convince an average school child in a classroom that the heliocentric model is right and the geocentric model is wrong. Again, heliocentric with a caveat that, again, it's not the sun, but there's the center of mass of the solar system. Within the Newtonian picture, and then Einstein introduces certain kinds of wrinkles to that. And today we have certain kinds of interesting complications with dark matter and dark energy, but with these caveats, with these Einsteinian caveats and caveats having to do with dark matter and dark energy, still, it is a pretty good approximation that the center of mass of the solar system is located within the sun. It's like 99.98% coincides with the center of mass of the sun, the center of the solar system, I mean. And it should be explicable. It doesn't need to take a genius to do that, right? And so, kind of my own thinking on this issue. This is why I bring up my Coursera course. I do not think I'm a genius professor. Okay, this is not the claim I'm making for myself. But the idea is that if the project of enlightenment is to succeed, somebody in my position doing not necessarily an outstanding job, but just doing an okay job, should be able to convince a person in the street or a first, second, or third year student. And what I find is that it's just not happening. It's not happening. And, I could say, well, it's just my fault and I need to do better. But again, the whole premise of the project of enlightenment is that it's not supposed to be rocket science. Because if it's so difficult that it takes like a completely, outstanding, out of this world genius, again, not making big claims for myself. But again, I've been teaching for 10 years. It was like, and I've been doing philosophy for about 20 years now and teaching for 10 years. If I cannot do it, then I cannot expect like an average teacher. It's like, okay, let's imagine I'm an average teacher. I hope I am an average teacher, not worse than an average teacher. But if I cannot do it, then nobody can do it. Well, sorry, I don't want to say nobody can do it, but like you need a critical mass. It means that there's a certain kind of difficulty. Not to mention that, again, I talk about Foucault, kind of science communication, all this stuff. There's Michel Foucault, there's Pierre Bourdieu, his important colleague, younger colleague, right? There's a bunch of other names who are people who are very important for me. Again, people like Jürgen Habermas or people like maybe even Michael Bouravoy, right? And the problem is that there are these wonderful people who are clearly much more brilliant than me, right? So I'm not making any claim like that. But I cannot make myself heard, and they cannot make themselves heard. And in fact, you go to YouTube, or you just do a Google search, you go to, I don't know, Coursera or something else, and you realize that, again, there's kind of this, in terms of this project of enlightenment, there's nothing like this consensus on values that I'm talking about, right? If you look at the leading professors of moral or political philosophy from the leading universities of the world, from the best publishing houses of the world, there's no consensus. Like, I am fairly convinced that Foucault has gotten it right, and I think this is the right way to proceed, and I still have this enlightenment hope that we will end up with a certain kind of a consensus. And again, Buddha, Marx, Foucault. So as a Buddhist, Foucauldian Marxist, I am still optimistic about the future. But it is, it is a very difficult enterprise. And again, there's a very important question I started asking myself this autumn about my credentials. Why should people listen to me? Why should people listen to me? And again, in terms of the arguments, there are no simple, straightforward arguments. And again, it's like, okay, listen to me. Why should people listen to Foucault, for that matter? How do you convert individuals to this position? Again, you run into both these problems. So against analytical philosophy, it's never about a single argument. It's not like I can, it's like if people, and again, we've had these very interesting discussions because we have to start talking about values at some point, right? So in a course of moral or political philosophy. And I do feel that, again, within this, let's say, Foucauldian paradigm, or what I have on the board is this Buddha, Marx, and Foucault, right? There needs to be a way to construct kind of an enlightenment project, again, between relativism and absolutism, between skepticism and trust, between the individual and the collective project. There needs to be some kind of a common ground. And, humanity is able to exist, right, in 2021 because we do actually have some kind of a consensus. I mean, again, think of the coronavirus pandemic. It's very clear that the vast majority of people are on board with a certain kind of common understanding that COVID is bad, that ideally, if you can avoid getting COVID, you should avoid getting COVID. If there's a safe and effective remedy, we should try to have it, as widely available as possible. So in practical terms, there is a certain kind of consensus. But as soon as people get into the same room, and again, I would imagine that most of my students are, practically speaking, on board with certain kind of common values. Practically speaking, we're on board. But in terms of philosophical discussion, there's nothing like a consensus. We're talking completely past each other, right? And some people are going to say, and of course, Foucault was known for his, radical, to some extent, maybe radically skeptical position, and also kind of radically skeptical moral position, right? So between skepticism and absolutism, between relativism and absolutism, between skepticism and dogmatism, somewhere in between, right? But at the same time, there's this kind of interesting observation, which is complicated, and I don't expect people to take this as a kind of a knockdown argument, but still, there's this very important, very palpable observation that Foucault is an academic. He is publishing books for the benefit of other people. He's publishing books that he expects, probably, right, expects other people to find interesting, to find enlightening. He's teaching a course in the Collège de France. He has this interesting relationship with his audience. He wants his audience to understand him. He wants the audience to ask questions, right? So in an important sense, you see, when we talk about the project of enlightenment, this isn't just some random thing. This seems to be, practically speaking, a very important presupposition for the kind of project that Foucault personally is engaged in, right? And so talking about Foucauldian ethics is a complicated enterprise, and I always have to, say Foucault's ethics with 3 question marks. It's problematic, but in practical terms, it's very clear that Foucault has a strong, robust vision of ethics, which is broadly speaking in line with the project of enlightenment. Yes, there's some skepticism about the project of enlightenment in Foucault, whether it can be realized, the realization that the project of enlightenment can be deployed as a certain kind of an ideology. This is very clearly there in Foucault. This is the hermeneutics of suspicion. This is, Foucault's Nietzschean and Marxist credentials, right? This constant suspicion of how the dominant ideas can be just masks for certain kinds of interest. Yes, 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 they're there. But at the same time, again, in Foucault's own practice, and we could obviously talk about Foucault's activism. I don't even want to begin this discussion now because it's a whole separate can of worms. But Foucault was very socially active, and there was a whole range of social issues that he was very passionate about, and he was very often there in the streets, protesting against certain things, agitating for some other kinds of reforms and policies. So Foucault actually, as a matter of fact, was very politically active. But even if you bracket this out, because this could get political and complicated and controversial, if you just stick with the ethics of the kind of enterprise he was engaged in, again, go back to this very simple assertion: he is talking to other people. He's trying to communicate a certain kind of vision to others, presumably because he hopes that this will be helpful, that this will be enlightening, that this will, again, help society move towards a better future. Again, this project of, yes, individuals, but together with others. And it's kind of interesting because, again, Foucault, in the Hermeneutics of the Subject, he examines the ancient ethics in which there was this interesting interplay between individual self-construction, yes, but self-construction with the help of others, as a member of a school, as a member of an Epicurean garden, or with the help of a mentor. And this is a relationship which is problematic, potentially, because, your mentors can be, in effect, in reality, just indoctrinating you, and that's always a problem. And this is why kind of Foucault's ethics always has to have this element of suspicion within it. But at the same time, Foucault needs to be sure enough, at least to some extent. He has to be, hopeful enough, sure enough, believe enough in his own project in order to publish his book, right? Because if he decided at the end of the day that what he's doing is just indoctrination, why would he publish the book, right? And this kind of goes back, talk about Foucault, but this kind of goes back to the sophists. And this is kind of an interesting problem, an interesting challenge. And to me, this is a very interesting and productive way of reading Plato as a sophist. Because why? Well, all sorts of things to be said about this, but among other things is that the sophistic arguments are known to us because Plato chose to preserve the sophistic arguments. We know about the arguments of the sophists from Plato. Think about Thrasymachus, think about Callicles. I feel that the most natural interpretation for me as to why Plato chose to preserve the arguments, because he saw the force of the arguments. You see, Thrasymachus says, or Callicles says, right? Justice is simply a mask for interest. Justice is simply a mask for interest. But notice what they are doing. Notice what they are doing. They are disclosing this knowledge. They are unmasking this knowledge. The sophists are supposed to be these horrible antisocial relativists, but are they? But are they? No, it seems to be that they are doing a great service to us at great risk to themselves. Both Thrasymachus and Callicles are challenging the powers that be. They are trying to unmask, right? To tear the masks off and to show to the people that society right now, their contemporary Athenian society, is based on deception and lies. And there is, a great selfless service on the part of Thrasymachus and Callicles. And with great danger, at great risk to themselves, they challenge the hegemony of the existing social order and saying, justice? This is not justice. This is just a mask for the interests of the stronger. And so I want to say that, within this unmasking of the dominant ideology, there is implicit, again, this kind of consensual project, ultimately, the bare bones of the project of enlightenment. I mean, maybe I'm wrong, and let's talk about this. By all means, let's discuss this. But to me, the natural interpretation of why Callicles and Thrasymachus are trying to unmask ideology, the natural interpretation as to why Nietzsche and Marx or Freud are trying to unmask the dominant ideology, the natural interpretation as to why Foucault tries to unmask the dominant ideology, is because implicitly they are following this hope of the project of enlightenment. That we can have a society which is not based on lies and exploitation, not based on force and fraud, but based on self-transparency of society. Society is transparent vis-a-vis itself. Society is accountable to itself, right? And as I say in my Coursera lectures, this is the promise of the Enlightenment, that we can have a society which is transparent and accountable to itself. And that's also the deep challenge of Enlightenment. Because is this a society in which we live? Is this the society that we see outside the window? And the answer seems to be very clearly no. Very, very, very clearly no, right? And again, I feel like I should be wrapping this up, but again, like, I do have a kind of a bit of a controversial reading of Foucault as a Marxist, I guess. But whether you like the word Marxism or agree or disagree with it, right? Just let's not get bogged down with the labels. Let's just think about this problem of repressive disublimation and ask ourselves the question as to how does society, and if you want, the capitalist system, does the capitalist system use our desires, our pleasures against us to control us? Again, who decides what's on our mind? The YouTube algorithm, the Facebook algorithm, the Instagram algorithm? Is it the advertisement in the street? Is it the way that the shops are laid out? Is it the advertisement on TV or on radio? It's kind of intrusion of society into everyday lives. Again, you walk into a store. Of course, we're in the middle of the pandemic, so I have no idea when was the last time you've been in person to the store. But sort of the last time I've been to a supermarket, again, it seems like, to a very large extent, like the supermarket is just full of things which are very clearly bad for individuals, and bad and addictive. And it's kind of interesting how, again, Foucault actually talks about how so we talk about sex, wealth, honor, glory, but we also talk about the diet. We talk about what people eat, right? And there's this kind of interesting question, constantly interesting question about human nature. But think about human nature and think about diet and health. Diet, exercise, and health, right? So we're very happy to be relativists and say, well, it's like some people like Shakespeare, some people like Mickey Mouse. But it's like, if you, it's like in terms of, I don't know, junk food, fast food, right? It's, or tobacco smoking or ingestion of alcohol. It's very clear that these things have a certain kind of very problematic relationship to human desires. These things are addictive. Alcohol is addictive. Tobacco is addictive and also very bad for your health. Bad for your health and bad for your well-being. And it's like, again, I have no idea. Well, I mean, if we ever get to a close reading of Foucault's hermeneutics of the subject, right? At one point he talks about, I think, Seneca's letter to Lucilius. I hope I'm not mistaken. And they talk about this interesting Latin phrase, which talks about like a certain kind of disease of the soul, that this Seneca's interlocutor writes to Seneca and says that they are not comfortable with themselves, that they feel bad, they feel like in a state of perturbation. I think that the Latin phrase is stultitia, something like this. Actually, I need to look this up again. Hopefully, if this will turn. Yeah, I hope it's. I'm gonna write this here with a question mark, and this is gonna be my homework to double check this. I think that the Latin phrase is stultitia, right? And again, it's like. You've had a day, long day, and you've had fun. You've had maybe a bit too much to drink, a bit too much to eat, right? And before going to bed, for a moment there, somehow, I don't know, the phone on your battery, the battery on your phone is dead, and you cannot just occupy your mind, flee into the busyness of the YouTube algorithm or browsing social media. And for a moment, you're forced to be with yourself. For just a brief moment, you're forced, against your will, to be with yourself. You would prefer not to be with yourself, but you are forced to be with yourself for just a moment. And you realize that you feel bad. Your body objectively feels bad. And your body feels bad because you've been doing bad things to your body, right? And we say, oh, what are values? Oh, Alex, you're being dogmatic, you're being totalitarian. How can you decide for people what's bad for them? Well, yeah, I mean, that's what smoking, drinking, and eating junk food does to your body. It's bad for your body, and it makes you feel bad. And like, not just feel bad, but it's also loss of control. It's not because you chose to become a drinker or a smoker or to eat junk food, because that's the society in which we live. This is kind of this problem with negative freedom. Negative freedom very often just leaves the individual open to being abused by the powers that be, by the governments or by the corporations, or very often governments and corporations work together. I mean, tobacco is, I think, a pretty good source of revenue for many governments around the world. So corporations profit, but also governments profit because of the, extra taxes, special taxes, whatever the economists call them, that are attached to products such as alcohol and tobacco, right? A certain kind of way of tapping into your desires and making you, in some sense, maybe slave is not the right word, but something like a serf, and you have to pay this tax, addiction tax. You're addicted to tobacco, and now you work, to some extent, you just work for this drug. It's like, think of the opium wars in China, and think of workers producing opium, right? Sorry, not producing, but workers effectively selling themselves into slavery or serfdom in return for opium, which is not good for them in any shape, matter, or form. But they're just addicted and they cannot quit their addiction. It's kind of a certain kind of internal whip, the pain of an internal slave driver, which is their addiction to opium, right? Yes. So yeah, microphysics of power and politics of the everyday. And this sounds, again, very individualistic, but I feel, again, the right way to bring this into the proper context is that, of course, the individuals are members of societies, and societies are based kind of, there's a certain kind of dynamic of the international relations, right? And these levels are linked together. And Foucault, to some extent, Foucault and, like, let's say, Karl Marx before him, tries to situate the individual within this larger context. To a very large extent, individuals are what societies make them, and societies, to a large extent, are shaped by the kind of international situation in which they find themselves. A geopolitical situation, struggle for power, but also economic situation, global economic situation. You can think of maybe Wallerstein and the world systems theory here. And this is kind of a huge nexus, which I think needs to be untangled. But again, Foucault's hermeneutics of the subject is a certain way to thematize the individual. But this isn't some kind of moral dandyism, egoistic dandyism. Let's focus on the individual for the sake of individual. I feel that kind of the global project of the social sciences has to see the interplay between the individual and the collective. And focusing on the microphysics of power is important, because if we want to understand like the kind of global politics, like, let's say, why capitalism is successful, why capitalist oppression in Marxist terms is successful, we have to see that there are, if you want, the micro foundations. There are the individual psychological foundations which, let's say, enable ideology. It's like a society-wide ideology, the deployment of ideology in the context of society or in the global context, because liberal capitalism is the ideology of the world today, right? This neoliberal governmentality, which Foucault also talks about, this biopower, biopolitics, right? There is a microphysical, like individual psychological foundation for that. And to me, this is kind of, thinking about Foucault is, in an important sense, a way to interface the discussion, I find Foucault's book, Hermeneutics of the Subject, to be very importantly on the interface between kind of attention to individual psychology, which primarily I see within the Buddhist tradition, and so interface between Buddhism, between Buddhism, which focuses on individual psychology. But Buddhism, I feel, doesn't take into account very often, or doesn't do it very well, take into account like the social dynamic, right? So between Buddhist emphasis on individual psychology and So Foucault as an interface between Buddhist individual psychology and Marxist, like global perspective, Marxist social and social international analysis, like social theory, if you want. Yeah. So I've been going on for quite some time. In some sense, again, these kinds of, thoughts out loud, can I call this a lecture? Well, very tentatively, it's kind of a draft of a draft of a draft of a lecture, I'd say. But this draft of a draft of a draft of a lecture, I feel, like the lecture is going up until the point that it just doesn't. So I think I've mostly ran out of things I can speak about at the top of my head. I really hope to continue this, hopefully in a slightly more structured format, and maybe, ideally, even go step by step and look at the development of the argument in Foucault's book and look at the individual chapters, because again, he starts with Plato's Alcibiades and he proceeds through individual, philosophers, individual philosophical schools, and he does talk at varying length. He talks about Epicureans and about the Stoics, a little bit about the Cynics, early Stoics, later Stoics. So I feel that there's a lot of value in actually exploring the ideas in the course and the techniques that he talks about. Especially again, keeping in mind that Foucault isn't just advertising the ancient way of life as the solution to our problems, right? But something to meditate on. Again, this idea in Foucault that kind of the task of philosophy is not to necessarily kind of universalize, but philosophy is an experiment, is an attempt to think otherwise, discover different ways of thinking and different modes of existence, right? And sort of to look at the Greeks, look in Greeks for a certain kind of inspiration for this kind of a project. So let me stop here. And I do hope that this was the first and the most disorganized video in a series of videos. I hope that this was instructive. I hope that this was fun. And maybe stimulating. So, well, trying to wind myself down a little bit. This is always kind of interesting to me how my style of teaching, which is not particularly mindful and very passionate, maybe in the kind of in the deleterious sense of the word, like passionate in terms of being driven by passion and kind of this experience of losing control, right? To a very large extent, my style of thinking of lecturing about Foucault actually goes against the spirit of the book about the care of the self that Foucault advertises, because again, my experience of giving a lecture like this is an experience of loss of control, whereas what Foucault finds valuable, I feel, in the ancient ethics is precisely the regaining of control. And yes, also kind of, instead of this mindless talking, the value of silence and introspection. So, and to me, this has always been a big problem and very interesting issue of how my teaching and my style of teaching pulls me in one direction, and the content of my teaching, the kinds of conclusions that I'm trying to reach, are to a very large extent kind of antithetical to the style. The ideas, the content of the ideas is antithetical to the style in which I present them. Well, anyway, colleagues, I feel that we should be wrapping this up. I'm trying to formulate some kind of an injunction to myself and to you a certain kind of wish that we could all be more mindful of ourselves. Again, this daily struggle to maintain mindfulness. And again, sort of for me, Buddha and Marx and Foucault are in this very interesting relationship of mutually reinforcing one another, right? So in this spirit, once again, I hope that this was maybe instructive and maybe stimulating. I do hope that we'll come back to these topics at greater length and maybe in a more structured and in a more calm fashion. I thought that before we wrap up, I need to take a look at the chat. Yes, Brian once again says good evening, and definitely good evening, Brian. I'm really happy that some people are watching this, and I'm not just talking into the void. But then Nikolai is asking a very difficult question about what is my resolution about the Enlightenment project. Well, and I mean, I think I owe Nikolai and everyone a certain kind of a straightforward answer, especially since I brought it up in today's talk, and. My solution is, my resolution is very much in line with what Gramsci, his wonderful slogan, Antonio Gramsci's slogan, pessimismo dell'intelligenza, ottimismo della volontà. When I look outside the window and when I ask myself about the future prospect for I'm alive and I hope, let's say, to be alive, 10, 20, maybe 30 years down the line. And when I ask myself what's going to happen to me, to my family, to my children, maybe, to my wife, my intellect makes me pessimistic because I see all sorts of ways in which humanity can subvert itself. But in terms of my will, I remain optimistic, right? Again, Gramsci's phrase, pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the will. We'll see. I think it's a work in progress, and it's definitely worth a shot. My realization that things are not as simple as I was hoping they would be is sobering and is to some extent pessimistic and makes me a little bit depressed. But on the other hand, you cannot, you'll never know unless you try. So I still think, I'm still kind of hopeful for the future. Yeah, I guess I am mostly. I still mostly optimistic, mostly hopeful about the future, even though I see a lot of challenges. But in any case, at the end of the day, we gotta try. We gotta try. And it's like I do hope that this series of lectures about Foucault is gonna happen, in the sense that I'm gonna be able to give them. And the question is, why make lectures on Foucault unless I do think that to some extent I can contribute to the Enlightenment project. So it's like, as long as I continue teaching, it means that sort of my preliminary resolution is that it's worth a shot. It's worth a shot. And then we'll see. Well, I mean, all sorts of things. I promise to think about this some more. Maybe I'll come up with a slightly better answer. Whew. Yeah. Nikolai says, how to make the contribution better, more accessible, without dumbing it down. Yes. That's the question. That's the challenge, and that's the challenge. I'm going to try to live up to, and time will tell. Anyway, colleagues, I think that's it from me. Thank you so much to everybody who has showed up. Thank you very much indeed for your company. And until next time, stay safe and take care.